Sure.
accident.
Sure.
He died instantly, and the basic reason why they could figure it out was he was on the cell phone and paying too much attention to the person he was talking to on the cell phone across the lane. Died instantly.
Oh, it's a real problem. It's definitely a real problem. I've just got a couple short poems. Should be able to squeeze these in, I think. These are, I've been thinking about for inspiration just kind of the use of, and the importance of memory, which is a workshop I'm going to be teaching on Thursday. And one of my earliest childhood memories is a true story. My next door neighbor, his name was Mr. Jennings. I don't know all of the details, but apparently he was terminally ill in some way and unfortunately shot himself in the backyard. And I remember this event very, very vividly, and I couldn't have been more than 4 or 5 years old because my younger sister was still kind of in a bike seat on the back of my mother's bike. And this poem recalls the memory of that because I ran into his wife. They had moved away as next-door neighbors when I was in my teens, and one time I was visiting back in Connecticut, and I ran into Mrs. Jennings, and we just kind of passed by each other. We didn't have time to actually stop and chat, but it prompted the recall of that day. And so this is a poem called Mr. Jennings. Last week, I saw Mrs. Jennings. She has not changed. Strange how her dyed blonde hair reminded me of the sun effusing through trees that morning when we lived next to one another more than 30 years ago. There are times that I wish I could not remember my front yard, the long slope of the Jennings driveway, that I had been as young as my sister, a toddler strapped to the seat on the back of my mother's blue bike, child enough to not be the one to tell you how I can still hear my mother's name coming from somewhere behind the house, wind carried in the shrieks of a new widow. I wish my mother did not have to find Mr. Jennings face down in the crabgrass, like our cement-covered wheelbarrow. That she did not have to turn over his lumbering body, thudding blood on her blouse. When working in the garden, that she did not have to stare into anther and pistil each spring, the translucent eyes of fatherless children next door. Why did she need to know terminal in the corolla of perennials? After so long a time, I can only tell you about the vague recall of sunlight, how I lived with the eclipse of a man's face, the photograph on the shelf of my neighbor's house named Mr. Jennings. When I walked past his wife at the local mall, a passing moment of a man also, one who yet unfolds in the still developing dark of me. It's one of those strange things that something triggers a memory, and you can use that and cultivate that for your own writing. Does anyone who's here today work on their own writing, or is kind of engaged in the process? I mean, I know Ben, of course. But, I mean, these are kinds of exercises that you can use. There's some value there. I have 2 final poems. This one is actually in dialogue with the Mr. Jennings poem, came out in a very different way. It's a very simple title. It's just called Pig. And some of the kids out here are very, very sharp. They said, "Is this a poem about the police?" And I said, "Well, kinda, yeah. There is that kind of element about it." And there are images of relating back, and remember, my father was a military policeman in Vietnam, and so this is also that particular vernacular, as derisive as it is of the police, was still very much in the nation's consciousness. I clearly picked up the word probably from my older neighbors, on the Jennings side. And this is a true story about the consequences of me at 5 years old or thereabouts, seeing a police cruiser go through our neighborhood and saying "pig" to the police cruiser. And my neighbor, who then went and told my father. and the consequences of what happened out of that. And there's an allusion to, we were talking about Orwell a minute ago, to Animal Farm in here, and the image of the pig kind of recurs in this kind of brief poem, so it's just called Pig. At 5 years old, I knew the word for authority. My neighbor heard me speak it to the cruiser trotting toward Cedar Crest, and then told my father, he a former MP in Vietnam, master of the chokehold. That evening, the dry pork loin on my plate grew drier still, from the white meat, the white noise, and my grandmother's word for something filthy, porco. Across the table, there were black truncheons in my father's eyes. As he rose on hind legs, striding toward me, it was as if to say, some animals are more equal than others. And no, I don't remember what I was eating at 5 years old. That's called poetic license. I just threw the pork in there to tie it together. It's, people are like, you really remember that? No, I don't. This is the very last poem I'm going to read. It's called In the Grain of an Oak, a Horse. It was as a result of studying with Martina Spada in July of 2005, who's kind of the subject of my dissertation, mentor and friend. And he has a poem called My Name is a Spada, and he said that here's, gave us a couple of prompts about name poems, and he said, I want you to think about your name. And of course, you have the allusion to Mr. Ed. I can't tell you how many times I heard that growing up. Yeah, okay, I'm not a horse, right? And then Carvalho, people would confuse it with like caballo, which is horse in Spanish. So there's the kind of poetic play on this. And Carvalho in Portuguese means oak. So it's kind of a poetic play of oak and wood images along with this kind of horse image as well. And it's very much an identity poem. In the Grain of an Oak, a Horse. I have only heard the rumors of Carvalho, how it means oak, the DE for family of removed in America. Some have said it denotes the horse, though I think they mistake me for a Spaniard. But I am Portuguese, I tell them, and I know very little of deciduous trees or horses. Perhaps my father heard the same thing as a boy when he was Eddie in a primordial house of cavacas and sweetbread, where a pig named Wilbur spoke to him from the black and white stump in the living room, told him he would have to one day accept the idea of becoming Mr. Ed. Mr. Carvalho suited him better. With body language you could make furniture out of. And I am sure this was when he decided to pass his machismo revelation to me, telling my mother to give me the name of two horses to make me strong. And what of my mother, the more tender of the two, who came from Tilford, Gaylord, and a great-grandfather named Hamlet? I have not been entirely true with myself. Who am I but a galloping throng of branches filled with sap and electricity? Emotions not quite pruned, knowing very little of his ancestry, how acorns grow out of the madness of a night watchman or a husband who forsakes his children. I am the past tense, Father Ed, Mother Ed, Call Ed, into the world from this swirling pool of man and woman. From Connecticut, little E, little Eddie, of military policeman and a nurse's aide. I have meatball eyes. Raise Ed Episcopalian on Sunday, move Ed to weep when part of me was bury Ed beside my mother and her mother, both drop Ed black lung Ed into the earth. I am a cancer, I should have mentioned Ed this, and I run from myself with mustangs in my heart, many leg Ed with a moon-driven sideways motion. What remains of me is Carvalho mispronounced. As a man, I have learned de Carvalho is closer to the truth, and like my father, I try not to let go of my leaves. Well, that's all I have. It looks like our time is basically up, and I don't know if there are any remaining questions or what happens at this point, but I want to thank everybody for coming out. I really appreciate it. I appreciate the engagement very much. Thank you to Ben for helping to coordinate this, and Emily and Marcia for having me as well. So thank you very much.